group members and then your ESCAP colleagues. Thank you for joining us today. And it's been already 2 months since we had our last meeting on 27th of April. So I also hope most of you were able to participate in person or online in the global platform for disaster risk reduction, which was held in last month in Bali, Indonesia. Personally, I participated in most of the sessions by online, and then I saw some familiar faces in some sessions. So before starting today's meeting, I would like to briefly give an overview of our last meeting. So last time we had our first series of 2022 sessions on production and compilation of the disaster-related statistical framework tables. The meeting discussed the experiences in documenting disaster occurrences statistics, and which was hopefully useful for our members and also participants. Also, as I mentioned about global platform, we agreed to postpone our last, the coming session, a May session of the meeting. As proposed in our plan for 2022, today we will discuss the background statistics and hazard exposure. So before we start our program, I'm pleased to share with you, ESCAP has a new statistician joining the team since the beginning of June. Mr. Tirapong Prapot Janaporan, my apology if I pronounced your name mistakenly, and he will be the main focal point for this technical working group for disaster-related statistics from next month onwards. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tirapong and extend our support to him. And Mr. Tirapong, would you mind to say hello and introducing very briefly to our members?
Yes, sorry, problem with the Teams app here. But Tirapong, I'm statistician at Statistics Division ESCAP, and pleasure to be here. I am new, but not so new with ESCAP. I rejoined ESCAP as 1st of June this year, but prior to that, I actually worked with Statistics Division for about 10 years. And I had a pleasure of being with the division and the so-called the expert group meeting on disaster statistics when it was started, I think in 2015 or 16. Yeah. I was part of this early initiation of the Asia Pacific disaster-related statistics initiative, and very happy to come back to this area and look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you, Tirapong, for the introduction, and then welcome again to the group, to home. And I look forward to working with you closely. Yeah. And again, let me remind you our today's meeting objective. We are here today to discuss the production and compilation of the background statistics and hazard exposure in disaster-related statistical framework tables. And of course, as usual, we have also a country experience sharing presentation. Today we have Mr. Sushil Kumar Sharma from Nepal, and then he will share us about Nepal's experience on disaster-related statistical framework. So with that, I would like to start our today's meeting, and I'm pleased to invite Ms. Shazna, statistician of Maldives Bureau of Statistics, to run our next session. Ms. Shazna, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yeah, As Madam Chair mentioned, I am Chasna from the Maldives Bureau of Statistics, and I'm really happy to facilitate this session on production and compilation of background statistics and hazard exposure. And a very good afternoon to everyone. And this session will be for 65 minutes, and there will be two presentations, as Madam Chair mentioned, on the background statistics, hazard exposure, and also the disaster-related statistics framework. And the first presentation will be by the ESCAP on the background statistics and hazard exposure and the DRSF, and the second part on the data sources for background statistics. And for this presentation, we will allow 40 minutes, and this presentation will be followed by a presentation by Nepal on the experiences on this topic, and this one will be for around 15 minutes. And after both the presentations, we will open the floor for another 10 minutes for the participants for discussions, comments, and any other questions if they have. So we will, throughout the session or after the session, participants may put forward their questions in the chat box here, the function allowed. And also you can provide comments by raising your hands. And yeah, and I do believe that this session will also be a very interesting one, as usual, as we do have in the past sessions. So without any further delay, I'm happy to introduce the first presenter from UNESCAP, Ms. Pia Pat. She's a research assistant at the UNESCAP. So Ms. Pia Pat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chesna. Okay, let me share my screen now. Sorry. Oops. Sorry, just some delay on my computer here. Okay, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. So as our moderator introduced, today we'll be talking about background statistics and hazard exposure and the DRSF. And here's the outline. Oh, I'm sorry, my computer kind of freeze. Right, okay. Here's the outline of the presentation. So let's start with the introduction. So when we look at the disaster risk management cycle, we have like this pretty familiar diagram. And when we look at this component of disaster related statistic framework, the background and statistics and the hazard exposure actually lies like on the left part of this diagram here. So where you can see the exposure, vulnerability, and coping capacity. This information actually help us to measure disaster risk. A number of statistics used for this part are drawn from population and socioeconomic statistic actually. And when we look back in the cycle of disaster management, it would be actually here before the disaster happened, but not necessarily like have to be rigidly there. But mainly we use them for risk management, risk assessment, the prevention mitigation, as well as preparedness. So what kind of use are we talking about when we talk about background statistics and hazard exposure? So actually, like when we want to make sure that new development does not exacerbate risk, we actually could use, for example, demographic statistics to help guiding policies for reducing risk, reducing exposures, and for identifying vulnerable groups, for example. Or we could use these statistics to update risk profiles to help us to make better decision in terms of investment in risk reduction measures. We could try to look into the statistics that help identify underlying factors of disaster risk, for example. Here, for example, like in the risk assessment, we could have the population density statistic to help understand, like indicate in the risk index to understand risk better. In terms of exposure to hazard, we could also combine the hazard map together with the map of population and critical infrastructure to help identify where exposure to hazards are by geographic regions, for example. So in terms of vulnerability, we could look into the statistics on the basic social and demographic characteristic of population and could help understand many things. One of an example is women's participation in post-recovery process. Also, like in terms of the coping capacity, we could use the data of existing DRR plan and strategies, for example, to understand the preparedness and help us better identify how much how local government adopt the DRR strategy, for example. These slides, like these pyramids, will be like elaboration of the previous slide, so I will not spend too much time on that. So now let's look at the DRSF table. Today we will discuss table B, the background statistics and exposure to hazard. We actually have four tables in total. So the first table is actually we look into the population background and hazard exposure. So in terms of the population, household number, the median household disposable income, and actually the hazard area. Like this bit actually would be the combination of the data from NSO and NDMA basically, and we could disaggregate them by geographical region to understand better the exposure. The next table is a B1B, which will look into different group of population and how they are exposed to different hazards. And in the DRSF, actually, like we recommend this type of data disaggregation to better address this asset vulnerability. So we have the age group, we have the sex, human settlement, as well as specific vulnerability groups. In the Sendai framework monitor, actually, like we recommend 3 age range here. But then, like for the fact that we also have infant children where like who actually really dependent on their parents or their caregivers more when it comes to emergency situations. So it would be worthwhile to look into this group as well. And there's so many reasons why we have to focus into different social groups. So for example, women, they have less access to livelihood and many of them dependent on natural resources. So when it comes to natural hazard, they tend to be more impacted by the disaster, for example. They're also known to have like less access to financing, for example, when it comes to recovering from disaster, like in terms of coping capacity, like this is quite important as well. Also, another part which was mentioned, like the participation in reconstruction effort. Actually, this is quite important that they are included and considered because yeah, like we should make sure that no one is left behind. And in terms of children, as mentioned earlier, like they're more dependent on parents and caregivers. But then we also see from our COVID experience, actually children, they get cut off from schooling, from nutrition, and from healthcare, for example. So numbers of kids like rely on their their school for meals. So when the school was shut for the COVID reason, they have less access to this, right? So this must be addressed as well. And in terms of person with disabilities, actually, like quite often that the needs of the person with disability are not incorporated in the long-term recovery and reconstruction efforts, actually. And often when it comes to evacuation, a lot of sites are not pretty well equipped with accessible facilities and services. So often like a person with disability may not be well facilitated when it comes to evacuation. Another group that is interesting to look into is the poor. They're more likely to live in hazard exposed area And many of them, actually quite big number, that are engaged in informal economy and not necessarily captured in official statistics. Also, they are less able to invest in the risk reduction measure, and they also have less access to insurance and social protection, for example. So these are not the only reasons, so just like some example that might worth looking into. And in the next table, table B2, we actually look into the critical infrastructure and land to understand like the exposure by hazard type. And we also have the next table, but pretty much of the information required here quite overlap with the another two tables on disaster risk reduction expenditure. So we hope to discuss this table later with the DRE tables. As we see numbers of data that we recommend to include in this table, so maybe we can do a quick poll. Ying, please, could you help launching the poll? All right. Okay. Right. The question is actually from the tables, actually not only the B2, all the tables you saw earlier. Where can you get data from? Please feel free to click. Yeah. Whether like it would be from your own organization, from other agency with data accessibility, or other agency but cannot access you those data, or some don't even exist in your countries, for example. Right. That's 3 response now. Right. All response. Interesting to learn that some of the data, like the highest result now is that some of the data is not available in my own country, which is quite interesting. And I hope we could discuss this later, actually. So, okay, let's move to the next part. Well, actually, before we move to the next part, we also would like to share with you. Many of you may have may know that we have this DRSF e-learning course, and the modules that are relevant to the tables today are module 2 and 6. So please feel free to visit them if you have not done so. And the next part, we're going to be discussing the basic concepts, definitions, and classification. So when we talk about disaster risk, it's actually, we talk about the function of the hazard exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. And actually, we have this definition that proposed by the Open and Intergovernmental Expert Working Group on Indicators and Terminology relating to disaster risk reduction. So they actually give quite a long, the brief definition here, which you can look later. Also, the hazard one, the exposure, like phenomenon that may cause loss of life, exposure located in a hazard-prone area, vulnerability, the susceptibility is the key, and actually the coping capacity is ability to manage adverse condition and risk or disaster. What is interesting in the context of table B's here is that like we also have these concept here: urban area, slum household, and person with disabilities. So actually, in terms of the urban area, we don't really have internationally agree definition. Actually, like different countries have different definitions. Actually, some would be bound by the administrative boundary, and some would depend on the size of the population, for example. Also, in terms of the slum household, UN Habitat actually provide this definition that it will be those inhabitants who actually suffer from one or more of the following, which is the lack of access to improved water source, lack of access to improved sanitation facilities, insufficient living area, or lack of housing durability, or even lack of security of tenure. The next bit is the person with disability. Actually, it's the definition provided here is from, if I recall correctly, from the convention. Well, sorry, I forgot the name, but it's actually not limited to only the physical disability, but we also have the mental, intellectual, and sensory impairments, which actually could hinder these people from participating fully and effectively in the society. So, for example, like we may see a person that from external appearance would look not different from us, but then like there might be some other impairment that cannot be noticed by eyes. So this is worth to be noted as well. Other definition would be critical infrastructure and land. When it comes to the classification, actually, like the tables in the DRSF, particularly the B tables, we adhere to this classification. The SNA, the CPC, the Central Product Classification, or the SEA, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, for example, the Central Framework one. And by showing this classification, actually, like if you want to adapt the tables into your own context, for example, by aligning with this classification, it would be easier when it comes to harmonizing data at the international level, and when you have to report like for the Sendai framework or the SDG, for example, it would be easier. An example here would be like dwellings. It could be different types of critical buildings or other buildings or structures, for example. And we also have the land cover and land use here, but it should be noted though that for statisticians who work with SEA framework before, this is actually a mix of land cover and land use. But I think for the use of disaster management purpose, I think like they're mixed here. And the next part is data source, which an existing tool, which here is actually in general like the risk statistic and different data source. But when we look into the specific tables, so here, like as we see earlier, we have the table A, B1A, right? And we also have the B1B here. So basically, most of these data like could be the joint work between NDMA and NSO, but then we also need access to data from different other line ministries as well. So for example, in terms of planning and finance, like in some country, national accounts are not really compiled by the NSO, for example, or health ministry or interior ministry in terms of infrastructure or even environment, for example. And in terms of table B2, which talk about mostly like the infrastructure and land, like we could have data sourced from other ministry as well, such as like environment for the land cover and land use, for example. Actually, what is also essential for these tables is that when it comes to the local data, I think it's important to get data from the local authority as well, both the emergency responders and local authorities actually. And as mentioned, like B3, we can discuss in more detail with the DRE table. So the next part is on the data source for background statistic, which I will hand over the floor to Petra. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. There are a number of data sources that can be used if we want to look at mainly to find out who the population is and what are their characteristics. This can be either to assess vulnerability prior to or exposure prior to a disaster, but also once a disaster has happened, and in order to inform the response, then agencies or responders want to use the data that's already existing. The first port, of course, obviously the census, which is the most extensive data source, since it's meant to cover the entire population. You can drill down to very small areas, look at households. So this is the big advantage. It's normally going to be available, sit in the National Statistical Office. The trouble is, though, that, as we all know, censuses tend to only take place once every 10 years. So there's a chance that the data might be out of date. If there's been, especially if there's been a lot of movement, if there's, let's say, a slow onset disaster and people have been moving rather than a sudden shock, then the data might not be reflective of the population. It won't always, it might under enumerate out of household populations who are difficult to reach. Actually, as all the data sources, it's a common disadvantage. So the main drawback, though, is that the data is likely to be out of date, which means that we can use it as a kind of baseline at a certain point, but then it's probably necessary to look at other sources of data, but to make it more up to date, but also to maybe in terms of the variables and characteristics, since the census might not capture all of those. I'm sorry if I'm jumping around the screen, but actually the next one I was going to go to was surveys, which are at the bottom right. So surveys, there might be surveys available. Now, some of these might be the regular, quite general household surveys which are carried out, such as demographic and health surveys or multiple indicator cluster surveys. But they might also be more specialized surveys. It might be surveys which have been carried out by agencies in a particular area, more of a kind of profiling exercise. It might be surveys carried out specifically to look at exposure or vulnerability. So the existence both of the surveys which are more generalized, part of regular survey programs, and then those very specialized surveys can be very informative. The problem about surveys is that usually they're based on samples. So you have to be aware of any biases that may come about because of the sampling. In particular, the household surveys tend to be done on a kind of cluster basis. And we know that when it comes to disasters and when people move especially, they're not just spread out evenly among the population. They do tend to cluster together in groups, and that means that the surveys might actually miss an entire group. They might not be representative of particularly vulnerable populations or of displaced populations. So that needs to also be taken into consideration. And similarly, looking at the dates when the survey was conducted to be able to assess whether it's going to be up to date and what's happened since the enumeration. If we go up then to administrative data, so there's the potential to look at the administrative data sources, ideally in conjunction with the other data sources. There's, depending on the government, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's possible to look at the civil registration and vital statistics, look at the civil registers, see where the population, use that to assess the population data, and also the birth and death. So if there has been a disaster, the civil registration can also be used for the flow statistics. It's possible to look at the education data. For example, if you want to assess, say, the number of children and you're not really able to get up-to-date data, say, from the censuses or the civil registration, education information could help you see how many children there are to inform a response or vulnerability. Similarly, for the health management information system, if you can use that to assess some of the characteristics or vulnerability, looking at, say, vaccination records, if again for the number of children or the number of mothers and so on, if you want to be able to help inform a response. And some countries have sample registration sites. So some countries where the civil registration is not sufficiently high, they use sample registration sites to assess the visor statistics. And if those sites are close to or are similar in their characteristics to the affected area, then that can also be a useful source of information. And finally, even though we're official statisticians, it's important to also look at the non-official data. There might be obviously quality issues, there might be coverage issues, but it's still important to see what is available in the entire data ecosystem to be able to inform the entire picture. So different agencies, different government agencies, development partners, or humanitarian actors may have conducted some different types of assessments or profiling. So this might be for needs assessments or vulnerability assessments, rapid mortality, population profiling. When you're in especially in a humanitarian response, that kind of data can be very, very useful. There's not always the kind of official data sources available, and also the timeliness might be particularly valuable in these cases. It's also possible to look at non-traditional sources to inform the response, or such as civil society generated data. There might be, for example, IOM have a displacement tracking matrix, which I think we'll talk a little bit about next week, where they often use things like focus interviews to assess displacement in a particular area, which sometimes there's no other data available because it's in such a difficult to reach area. And some countries also have these demographic surveillance sites. They're different to the sample registration sites because they're not official. They're usually run by academic agencies or development partners. And in those, they have one area where they look in depth at the demographic and health characteristics of the population. So again, if there is an area close by which has similar characteristics to the area that you might be interested in, then that can be useful source of information. But again, all these non-official data sources, they do have to be taken in, the disadvantages also have to be taken into account. Again, that coverage or data quality, and care taken when using them. Next slide, please, Paul. All right, so here we've got a number of tools and guides. I go through some of them which I added to the list, and I'm going to hand over to Paul to go over the ones that she added to the list. What I'd like to do actually is, Paul, can I share my screen, because I've got the tools open, so I can just quickly go through them.
Sure, let me unshare my screen.
Okay. So let me share mine now. Okay. All right, so the first one that I've opened up here, this is this World Data Pop. And this is a fantastic resource that they've, because you can go down to the sub-national level. So here, you can see, I think this is, Afghanistan, I think. And then you can see here that they've gone down right down to the sub-national level, where you can actually see the population. And if you go through the site there, you can also download the data. They also have the population age and sex structures. So that's really useful that they've brought in all the different data sources to come up with an estimate of the subnational population by age and sex. And they have it up to 2020, which is really fabulous. So this is a really valuable resource. And actually, we had a Stats Cafe webinar on this about 2 years ago. So we can also link to that, which describes in a bit more detail how to use this resource. But this is one that we very highly recommend. Here's another one which is looking at Azerbaijan here, and just to go down to the sub-national level, they go down to the lowest, I think they go to the lowest administrative unit. So that's a really fantastic resource. Another resource that helps here is the UNHCR demographic projection tool. And this is a projection tool which allows you to project forward a population based on the population, the kind of the base population that you have. You can make different assumptions about the fertility and mortality, and then you can project forward. So when I was at UNHCR, we developed this tool to help inform humanitarian response. So they could be planning for the number of say children, the number of mothers or women of reproductive age, the number of elderly. So you can use this tool if you do have some data which might be out of date, but you can make assumptions about the fertility and mortality. You can then project forward. It just uses the cohort component projection model, so there's nothing particularly fancy, but it's just a very easy to use tool. Here, this is the Demographic and Health Survey Program, and I love this one because they make, if you go here, you've got all the data sets available. And if you don't want to download the data sets and use them in whatever software you might use, they have a stat compiler where you can add in what you're looking for. So if you wanted to find out, say that the education level, the number of children, fertility rates, you can do that here in this stat compiler. So it's a very, very good tool. So if there is a country which has had a DHS and you need some of the information that's here, you can go to all the, you can choose all the indicators that they have available, you choose the country, and then it gives you the results without having to download the data. If you want to go more into detail, though, obviously you can also download that data. Similarly mixed, this is the UNICEF Household Survey Program. It's a bit similar to DHS. So if there's not a DHS, then you can also have a look and see if there's a mix. It's not quite as user-friendly as the DHS, but you can access the reports with the survey findings, and you can download the data to be able to look at the data. So not quite as easy to use. It doesn't have quite a good a tool as for querying the data as they do in DHS, but you are able to download that data and maybe look at the report to see, if you don't want to download, to see if you can find the data that you need. Next tool that we have here is just, this is some guidance from UNSD on integrating a gender perspective into statistics. And similarly, we have some guidance on disability and this is a bit out of date. There might be something newer, but this is the work on disability statistics in official statistics. And then quite an important one when we look at one of the background characteristics is urban and rural, and this is some help to actually be able to decide what's urban and rural, and which is, as I'm sure you can imagine, quite challenging to get some to make this kind of harmonized and comparable between countries and areas. Another tool that we have here, this is an agency called JIPS, the Joint IDP Internal Displacement Profiling Service. So as the name might suggest, they do a lot of work on profiling in humanitarian displacement situations. And here they've developed a toolbox for conducting profiling. So that's quite useful. If there is a humanitarian response, this provides some guidance on how to conduct profiling. They also have a very good guidance here on conducting, this is a tool for urban multi-sector vulnerability assessment tool. So it's displacement context, but it can be also used in other contexts as well. Similarly, the World Food Programme, they have a vulnerability assessment and mapping resource center. Assessment and monitoring resource center. So you can see here's some guidance on how to actually carry out this kind of vulnerability assessment, obviously with a focus on food security, but that covers also a lot of relevant areas for disaster statistics as well. And finally, this overlaps a little bit with some other tools, but there's an agency called ESCAP, which has done some work here on risk analysis methodology. to how to carry out risk analysis. So that's also another useful tool. And with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll hand back to Paul. We'll go over the remaining tools. Paul, over to you. Paul, are you there?
Can you hear from this one?
Paul, are you there? Do you want to share the slides and go over the remaining tools? So, okay, so until maybe I can share then, because Paul's wishing that her computer's frozen. Let me just get the PowerPoint up and I can share it. One second. Okay, got the PowerPoint. I hope this is the latest one that I've got. Okay. So if I go through, I think what Paul wants to go over, this is the informs disaster risk indices. And I hope Paul will take over soon, but because this is more her area. But as you can see, that they've created a dashboard. It allows you to access the risk index in each country, as well as the hazard and exposure risk, the vulnerability risk, and they have other measures on that dashboard, and they've done this in every country. So here they've classed the countries by their risk, whether that's through hazard and exposure, vulnerability, lack of coping capacity. So they've classed them into these different very high or high and so on. And here are the components that have made up these indices. So in the hazard and exposure component, they've divided it into natural and to human. So the natural, they look at the frequency of earthquakes and floods and tsunamis and so on. I can see they also have epidemic. I don't know if that one was new and added in as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also they make an assessment of conflict intensity and conflict risk. For vulnerability, they've divided it into socioeconomic and vulnerable groups. Socioeconomic is divided up into development and deprivation, inequality and aid dependency. And the vulnerable groups are uprooted, which I assume means displaced, and then other vulnerable groups. And the lack of coping capacity is divided into institutional and infrastructure. So the institutional, the disaster risk reduction and governance, and then infrastructure, communication, physical infrastructure, and access to health systems. I'll just say, Paul, are you back, or do you want to take over?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for
continuing go ahead.
that. So apology for the technical inconveniences. I think it might be something to do with Teams or, yeah. If you don't mind, could you please continue sharing the slide? So yeah, the next indicator, the next index that similar to the previous one, which could be useful tools, is the World Risk Index. And actually, if could you please move to the next one? Thank you. When we look at the sorry. Okay, maybe I'll request control.
Okay, perfect.
Lovely, thank you. Right. Right. When we look at this next slide, like we have the ranking, which is if we compare with the previous one, is a bit different. So here, like the previous one, we have a number of sub-Saharan countries, and here we have quite a few bit of the Pacific countries as well. So if we look into the indicators they use, it might explain here that we have the sea level rise is taken into consideration here. So like this is just for sharing the existing tools that could be used for your consideration. Actually, I'm not saying like which one is better or yeah. And right for the oops sorry. Right. Here, we have the national level example. We have the ones from Indonesia, INARIS platform. Actually, like it actually allows you to look into different type of hazard, and then like also we can focus on certain type of risk, vulnerability as well. So here's a zoom in of the Jakarta part. And okay, so those are the example that we have of the tools. And then when it comes to the institutional dimension, like similar to last time we talked about, the coordination between NSO and NDMA is quite important, because like we should make sure that the concepts are harmonized, and then like in the future we could integrate data easily. This also include the classification and the definition as well as methodology, and that's why like when we have metadata, it would help guide us like how we should follow certain methodologies, for example. But then again, as mentioned last during the last meeting, like these characteristic of the quality of statistics, for example, like we cannot really have everything all captured in the time of emergency. So we might have a trade-off between the timeliness and the accuracy, for example. But then again, like because these data are background statistics, right? So like we can later look into them and kind of review and revise, like to make it better and more accurate, for example. And as we see in the data source, like the coordination could be beyond NSO and NDMA, and actually like other stakeholder in the line ministry in local government should be considered. And as Petra mentioned, there are other sources of information as well. It could be like civil society, it could be various international organization or regional organization that prepare very good data set and could be used as well. So coordination beyond would be important as well. And in terms of the linkages to SDG, actually, like we have a similar slide to last time. So like here's a Sendai framework, and the SDG mainly is goal 1 and 11 and 13. But when we look deeper, there might be some data that could help facilitate reporting either indicator as well, like what's sorry. In the previous slide would be handy to use as well. And for this table, thank you, Petra. So we could see that there are other targets and other goals that we could make linkages as well. And for the table B's, like it help us in terms of reporting for SDG 1.5.1, Sendai, target A, target B, target C, and SDG 1.5.2. And I think that might come to an end. And I would like to thank Petra, as well as another colleague, Nasikan, who helped for their inputs in this presentation. So I think that comes to an end. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Petra and Ms. Perfect. And in your presentation, as you've highlighted that you've highlighted all the components of the DRFS, as well as the uses of the background statistics and the hazard exposure together with the basic concepts, definitions, the classifications, which is very important for us as NSOs and other stakeholder agencies for the compilation of these related statistics as well. And also you've highlighted the data sources and the existing tools as well as the important indices and also the linkages with the SDGs as well and the Sendai framework. So it is very helpful through your presentation. It makes us easier for us. And also in the poll, we've noted that in the poll that for the table B2 on the exposure of land and infrastructure by hazard type, that one showed that most of them, I think it's 62%, right? Some of the data, the majority showed that some of the data is not available in the country, right? So this also shows the need for us to improve the data we collect through different sources and to strengthen the data system across different stakeholder agencies as well. And as in Ms. Pia Pack's and Ms. Petra's presentation, you've discussed that we need to have a good coordination between the NSO and the NDMA as well as the other stakeholder agencies to improve these related data, right? So thank you once again. And before we go to the next presentation, I would like to remind you all that you can put forward your questions in the chat box. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Sushil Kumar Sharma, Director, Central Bureau of Statistics, Nepal, to present Nepal's experiences on background statistics and hazard exposure. Mr. Sushil Kumar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Swazna. Respected Chairperson, ESCAP colleagues, and the dear participant, I am Sushil Kumar Sharma, Director of the Central Bureau of Statistics, Nepal. Please, next slide. Yeah, I am sharing the experiences of how the disaster related data is collected in the Nepal and what is the coordination between the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is actually collecting the administrative data related to the disaster, and the Central Bureau of Statistics, which is the National Statistics Office, is doing census surveys and publish the environment statistics of Nepal regularly, including the disaster related data. First, in my background, hazard is a potentially damaging physical event, phenomenon or the human activity which may cause the loss of life or injury, property damage, social and the economic disruption or the environmental degradation, and characterized by its location, intensity, frequency, and the probability. It has been taken from the International Strategy for the Disaster Reduction 2004. All you are hearing here?
Yes.
All you are hearing?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the exposure refers to the element as risks from the natural or man-made hazard event, and the hazard exposure is the state of being in which the person or a group of people remains in an imminent risk of danger. It is just the background for my presentation. Please, next slide. Yeah. In Nepal is one of the disaster-prone country due to its topography and our climatic condition. Country is small, but we have the different type of climatic conditions, and our country, mountain, hills, plain region is very different type of the topography. And the earthquakes, landslides, floods, fire, thunderbolts are the major causes of the disaster events in Nepal. Environmental degradation and the climate change both interact with and exacerbate the occurrence and the impact of the natural hazard events. And similarly, the yearly loss of life, property, and the significant proportion of the gross domestic product GDP due to these disaster related activities. Please, next slide. Yeah, what is this climatic impacts in Nepal? it has been estimated by different research and surveys or the research. The temperature rises 1.5 to 2.7 degrees Celsius in 2021, and the black carbon in the high mountains. Nepal is one of the mountainy country, and continuously the snow is melting and the black carbon in the high mountain and the glacier melting. And due to this impact, desertification, drought, flood, landslide, similarly impact on the water, energy, food, biodiversity, urban and the rural settlement. Similarly in the tourism, this may affect due to this climate-induced disaster. And it has been estimated that 1.5 to 2% GDP loss yearly due to this disaster occurrence in Nepal. And it has been estimated that 13% of the GDP loss in by 2021 due to this climate-induced disaster. Basically, many research has been already tell us that the poor, indigenous, marginalized, women, girls, children, disabled, all the groups are the mostly impacted by these climate change activities. Next slide, please. Yeah. What are the major existing legal and the policy framework in Nepal? Our constitution of Nepal, it has been already mentioned that disaster risk reduction management is a shared responsibility. We have the three tiers of the government. We have national government, like the provincial government, and the local level. So this is a shared responsibility, all the tiers of the government. And we have the Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act 2017. It has mentioned to coordinate and implement disaster risk reduction management and establish the National Council for the Disaster Reduction and the Management, NCDRR it is called. And similarly, National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority. According to this act, it has already been established, this NDRRMA in Nepal. And from the Gorkha earthquake 2015, there are very large and devastating event in 2015 and other recent disaster. We made the National DRRM Policy 2018, Disaster Reduction Strategy Action Plan 2018 to 30, and the Comprehensive Planning Framework for the DRRM. And the government of Nepal is committed to the implement of the new Sendai framework for the disaster reduction 2015 to 30. Similarly, I am from the NSO, National Statistics Office, and we have developed National Strategy for the Development Statistics, NSDS. In this NSDS, it has already been mentioned to collect and publish this disaster-related data. This is the responsibility of the NSO. It has been mentioned in this NSDS. And similarly, for the different ministries and the department, it has been designated the disaster focal person to look after the disaster-related activities. Next slide, please. Yeah. Ministry of the Home Affairs is responsible for, already I mentioned that, Ministry of Home Affairs is responsible for the admin data for the disaster management information system. It has been producing biennial National Disaster Report since 2009. And there is the National Emergency Operations Center, NEOC, and it manages the DRR portal. DRR portal managed by this NEOC, which is in the MOHA, Ministry of the Home Affairs, and which containing policy plan and a designated focal person and the incident maps. Similarly, we have this Sahana system, an open source web-based platform. You can see in the website this Sahana system and customized for the disaster. Similarly, we have the disaster information management system, which is basis for the evidence-based decision support system, a repository of data, information, policy, and key decision of all levels on the disaster reduction management. Similarly, a platform for fostering data partnership and the common system. And this DIMS provides the real-time data like the hazards, events, affected population, and the casualty. All these things we can get from this DRR portal. Similarly, the local level disaggregate data and the capacities and the humanitarian agency also preparedness. These activities are also in our DIMS system. And CBS role, what is the role of the CBS? It means National Statistics Office is to conduct census and surveys and the compilation and the publication of the disaster related data. Basically, we are publishing this disaster related data with our publication of this Environment Statistics of Nepal, which is on basis of the FDS. FDS is the framework for the development of environment statistics developed by United Nations Statistical Division. There is one thematic area, disaster. In that area, we published the data related to the disaster. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the DRR portal. It is conducted by the Ministry of Home, and all, please see here, and this is the district. In Nepal, there are 77 districts, and the municipality name, what are the incident date, death in the gender wise, male, female, and similarly missing people and the loss and damage. All these things we collect by this DRR portal, and we can see this all this data, live data in the DRR portal. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are the publications of Central Bureau of Statistics, National Statistics Office, and the last publication in 2019. And this is the Environment Statistics Nepal. Similarly, in a regular interval of time, we also publish the compendium of the environment statistics. The basic difference between these two publications is that this is Environment Statistics of Nepal, basically the database, and in the environment compendium, we more analytical reports. We invite the resource persons, experts, and they prepare the very analytical report in this environment compendium of the environment statistics. Next slide, please. Yeah, and disaster and the basic data. In we conducted the population census in 2021 in Nepal. In that questionnaire, we have one community level questionnaire in that census. In Nepal, the lowest administrative unit is the ward, and in Nepal, near about 7,643 wards, and from every ward, we collected this community questionnaire. In that community questionnaire, there were the questions related to the natural disaster and the hazard like flood, landslide, soil erosion, inundation, thunderstorm, hailstorm, sporadic rain, heat wave, cold wave, drought, avalanches, etc. These are the most occurrence disaster related events in Nepal, and the loss of life and property due to this disaster related event we collect in our in this community questionnaire. Now the data entry is going on. Maybe within the 6 months we can get the report, and this database is very useful, and we can make as a baseline data for the disaster mapping and other special disaster related data, disaster related survey. And in the NSO, or in the Central Bureau of Statistics, we have the Environment Statistics section in CBS. I am the director of that section, and we publish within the 2-3 years interval of the time. We published, already I mentioned, Environment Statistics of Nepal within the guideline of the United Nations framework for the development of environment statistics. And similarly, we published the Environment Compendium, which is the more analytical type of report. Next slide, please. Yeah. In 2016, we conducted National Climate Change Impact Survey. This was very pioneer survey in Nepal. Basically, the knowledge, effect, impact, and adaptation practices. We collect this information in that survey, and we collect different climate-induced disaster-related data. What are the loss of people and the property due to climate-induced disaster? These kinds of information we collected in that survey. In 2016, we conducted that survey. Next slide, please. Yeah, challenges. The major challenges is uncertainty of risks due to climate change. This is the major, because we are on the most vulnerable country in the world due to the climate-induced disaster, and lack investment in preparedness and the early action. And we have the knowledge gaps in understanding the diverse risks due to limited scientific assessment, in information, technology, and the knowledge on the practical aspect of the disaster risk management, in proper allocation of budgeting, planning, and execute activity related to disaster risks, in linkage among the institution agency involved in forecasting, managing, and assessing the risks and the response, in bilateral, multilateral, and international effort to tackle the transboundary nature because the climate is the transboundary natures type of, mostly the climate-induced disaster or other disasters are the transboundary nature. These are the challenges which we feel. Next slide, please. Yeah, expectation and the way forward. Yeah, government of Nepal is developing the understanding among all tiers of the government and stakeholders. Already I mentioned in Nepal we have 3 tiers of the government. It is necessary to make the understanding and the coordination between these 3 tiers of the government. And the government of Nepal works in the collaboration and the partnership with the stakeholders for the effective disaster reduction and the management in Nepal. And similarly, it established the focal desks for the disaster risk management within the ministries and established of the national multi-stakeholder platform for the DRR. But basically, it has established, but some problem for the coordination because we are the developing countries. I think all you know these things. Similarly, effective and the integrated implementation of disaster information management system, sharing of the disaggregated data. Data sharing is also one of the problem in our country, and similarly it is needed to strengthen the environment status section of the CBS because the environment is the cross-cutting issue, so it is needed to strengthen, and similarly it is needed to strengthen the GIS of the NSO also, and need special surveys and censuses. We feel to do these special surveys related to the disaster and all the environment activities. Next slide, please. Yeah. Better understanding of the risks through research, surveys, and assessment. And another thing I want to share is that second round of the National Climate Change Survey we are planning to conduct in our next fiscal year. After this 1 month, our next fiscal year will start. We are planning to conduct National Climate Change second round survey, and now we are discussing. Now I am in outside of my office, outside of the from our office. It means capital city to discuss the methodology, any changes to the methodology from our first survey, or the what are the things we include in the questionnaire. Now we are collecting feedback suggestions from our stakeholder, and in next it means in next fiscal year we are planning to conduct the second round of the National Climate Change Survey. And similarly, it is needed to improve institutional arrangement and the structure and the bilateral international cooperation for the knowledge and technology also it is expected, and empower leadership of province and the local government. It is now just in Nepal, the local level election has been completed. It means new leadership has been come in our local level. So it should be the empowered or the local leader. It is also that these kinds of capacity development program are needed for these things. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. These are my presentation. Your comments and queries are highly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sushil Sharma. You have taken us through the Nepal's experiences on the disasters you face and the climate impacts and how you tackle the data needs on the related data as well, and also showed your commitment to the implementation of the Sendai framework as well, and also your effort to establish a focal desk for DRM within ministries and the platforms for DRR seems very interesting for us actually. So thank you once again, and now I would like to open the floor for questions, comments on both the presentations. We do not have any questions in the chat box, so I would like to open the floor for any questions. You may raise your hand. You may use the hand raise function. Anyone? If not, I do have a question for Mr. Sushil. As you've said that during the census 2021, you've introduced a community questionnaire in the process, right? I would like to know how actually you implemented this questionnaire, the timeline. Is it during the census period or prior to the census? And which components you included in the community questionnaire? Mr. Sushil?
Oh, thank you, Sajna, and thank you for your question. Just we completed the population census 2021. We have the household level questionnaire and all these things, but separate we developed the community questionnaire. There are many thematic areas like their what are their basically there are many thematic areas. One of them thematic area, there is one disaster in that community questionnaire, like in our rural, it means rural or the urban municipalities. After that, the ward level is the lowest administrative unit of Nepal. And what are the things, what kind of facility they are getting from this, what are the facilities they provided the local government to the people, access to the road, access to the drinking water, and access to the school and health post, all these things. These kinds of information we collected in that community questionnaire. And similarly, one of the thematic area is also the disaster. These things we collected at the time of the census period. At the census of the period, enumerator and the supervisor fill out this community level questionnaire in the census period. Now the data entry is going on the bureau. So maybe within the 6 months, this result will come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sushil. Yeah, there is one question here. Can you share the guidelines for National Climate Change Survey conducted by CBS Nepal? Mr. Sushil, it's a question for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, why not? Our already in our website cbs.gov.np we have this report. I'll share in the chat box the linkage of that our publication. And next round of the survey we are trying to conduct in our next fiscal year. Sure, I'll share this link to the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sushil. Also, could you share the community questionnaire as well?
Oh, okay. That community questionnaire. Community question. I think it is in my laptop or not now. Anyway, I'll share to the port, and definitely she will share all the participant. Maybe within today, tomorrow, I'll share this community questionnaire to the port, and it will share all of our participants. Okay, I'll share the community questionnaire. Okay.
Thank you. Any other question from the floor? I don't see any other. Yeah, Tirupon?
Hi, sorry for turning off the camera. Just make sure that I keep my bandwidth. And hi, Sushil. Long time since our last working together in 2016. My question is not directly to Sushil, but general to the technical working group. When we look at so-called data during the peacetime, things that we should collect before disaster occurs. So that there are usually two main purposes for that, right? One is to assess risks in different areas of the country, and those perhaps very same baseline information would be also used for assessing impact after disaster occurs. So every time when we have disaster and we need to do the process and needs assessment, big question always come: do we have baseline information enough to assess the impact? So my question to the group is do you have any challenges in compiling those baseline information, either population or housing infrastructure exposure to disaster, And if you do, how do you cope with all those challenges? I think that's is always the issue when I remember when I work with the PDNA exercise in Thailand. It was extremely difficult to find baseline data in time for proper assessment of the impact.
Oh, thank you, Terapong. Oh, long time we in the contact. In Nepal, basically my sharing for this, and in Nepal, Ministry of the Home Affairs, which collect this admin data, they have their local level units, district administration office. They collect this. What I understand from your view that our ministry collects this baseline data and this admin data from their local level unit, which is called the district administration office. They collect data from there, and from other sources they collect. I think I mentioned your or not.
Ms. Spectra or PFX, would you like to comment?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good practice that data collection, no, data compilation exercise is routine, and that will ensure that when things comes, then we have proper information in place. So I'm also wondering about other countries' experiences. In Thailand, I'm not talking on behalf of my country, but from what I heard from many from colleagues, that two main challenges. One is access to data. They may know where data are sitting, but they don't have access to them. And second issue is surrounding interpretation and operational installation of all the definitions for statistical purposes. We have clear definitions of disasters, of risk, exposure, vulnerability. But when it comes to actually doing statistics and looking at those definitions again, there are much of issues that what do they actually mean, and how do we compile them according to the definitions. So I'm not sure if other country has other challenges that they face.
So, anybody would like to comment on this note?
Yeah, just for example, if I again remember correctly, and if we have Indonesian colleagues in the room and can correct me, there was an issue between data access between NDMA and BPS, the NSO of Indonesia. So what they did was to create an MOU between two organizations for real-time data access between two organizations. Then that was a backbone for their disaster database that Paul showed to us earlier on. So that one solution to data access issues.
I think that's how other countries as well. In Maldives also, if, the data sharing, we do have data sharing agreements here, like Theerapong mentioned. We do not have any other questions. So now I would like to hand over the floor to the chair for the closing session.
Thank you, Ms. Shazna, for your great facilitation and then keeping on time the session. And then also I would like to thank our presenters, Ms. Paul, Ms. Petra, and Mr. Sushil for their very informative and then rich presentations, providing lots of available tools and then resources for the data. And then also thank you, Mr. Sushil, for very interesting presentation about Nepal's statistics. And also thank you for willing to share the documents through Ms. Po, and then hopefully we can get the resources in a couple of days. And thank you very much. So we are close to the end of today's session, and then before closing the session, I would like to ask ESCAP Secretariat, is there any housekeeping announcement for our members? If not, I will close the meeting. So, yeah.
Thank you, Aruna. Also, thank you, Ms. Chasner, for excellent moderation. For our next meeting, it is yet to confirm whether the time would be the same time as we usually do. So we will consult in the team and we'll circulate this in the email again. And as Sushil mentioned, we will circulate the material from Nepal to you soon. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much from our end. Thank you very much, Ms. Chair.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Po. So about the date, is it still scheduled on 27th of July?
Yes, the date is still the same. It's just the time that we are yet to confirm.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well noted. Thank you very much. So as Ms. Po said, we will expect the email from the secretary the next couple of days, and then please actively participate the choosing the time for our next meeting. And then for our next meeting, it is scheduled as usual, the last Wednesday of each month. And then it'll be on Wednesday, 27th of July. And the time will be fixed later. So please mark the date on your calendar not to miss our next session. So without any delay, I would like to close the technical working group meeting for today close. Thank you very much again for your time and then active participation. And then thank you again for our moderator, Ms. Shazna, presenter Ms. Po, Petra, and Mr. Sushil for their excellent presentations. And then we'll see you next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.